Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories like this one. Here you'll find deep, emotional narratives about resilience, hidden truths, and lives changed by unexpected choices. If you enjoy thoughtful storytelling with strong characters and meaningful journeys, stay with us. And if this story speaks to you, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Now let's begin. The house felt wrong even before the last guest left. It was not empty yet, not truly, but something essential had already withdrawn from its walls. Eleanor sensed it in the way voices echoed too clearly down the hallway, in the way footsteps no longer softened out of instinct when passing the living room. Grief had not settled here like a blanket. It had been briskly folded and set aside, making room for something colder and far more practical. The funeral itself had been flawless. Eleanor could not fault a single detail. The chapel was filled with flowers, expensive and abundant, their scent so heavy it clung to her clothes and hair long after the ceremony ended. Lilies dominated the arrangements, white and severe, standing in careful rows that spoke of money spent efficiently rather than affection offered freely. The priest's voice had been calm and measured as he spoke of generosity, of legacy, of a family bound by shared values and enduring unity. Eleanor listened, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere above the altar, where the light from the high windows fractured into pale dust. The words washed over her without sinking in. Togetherness, stability, love. They sounded rehearsed, as though chosen not for their truth, but for their appropriateness. Her siblings cried when expected. Marcus dabbed his eyes with a crisp handkerchief, his shoulders held straight even as his mouth trembled slightly. Clara sniffed softly, accepting embraces with practiced grace, murmuring thanks in a voice pitched low enough to suggest sincerity. Others followed their lead. Eleanor cried too, but her grief moved inward instead of outward. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, unacknowledged by anyone around her. She had learned long ago that drawing attention to her feelings rarely brought comfort. It was easier to let them pass unnoticed. At the reception afterward, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. The first half hour belonged to condolences and lowered voices. Then conversations began to change shape. People leaned closer together, speaking of travel arrangements, of work schedules, of how quickly time seemed to move. Someone mentioned legal matters in a hushed tone, as though it were impolite to discuss such things so soon, yet no one objected. Eleanor noticed how easily the future entered the room, how quickly her parents' absence was treated as something already concluded, filed neatly away. It frightened her, not because she expected the world to stop, but because it never seemed to slow at all. That evening, back at the family home, Marcus stood near the fireplace and announced they would meet with the notary the next morning. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Authority came naturally to him, as it always had. He spoke as though the decision had been agreed upon already, as though the gathering were a formality rather than an invitation. Eleanor nodded when his eyes briefly met hers. She did not trust her voice enough to speak. The night passed restlessly. Eleanor lay awake in her childhood room, staring at the ceiling where the faint glow of the streetlight outside traced familiar shadows she had known since adolescence. The room looked unchanged, yet it no longer felt like it belonged to her. Most of her things had disappeared over the years, absorbed into storage, redistributed, or quietly discarded. She wondered when that had happened, when her presence had become optional rather than assumed. The notary's office was small and formal, lined with dark wooden shelves that smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Eleanor took the chair at the far end of the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her siblings filled the remaining seats with easy confidence, crossing their legs, adjusting their coats, exchanging low remarks. No one spoke directly to her. She felt less like a participant and more like an observer invited to witness a process already decided. The document was read aloud in a neutral, practiced voice. The family home, with its manicured garden and tall windows that caught the afternoon sun, would remain jointly owned by the siblings. Eleanor felt no surprise at that. She had not imagined herself continuing to live there, had not pictured a future where her voice would matter in discussions of renovation or sale. It was as it had always been. The words settled around her like confirmation rather than news. Then the notary cleared his throat and mentioned the second property. It was described briefly, almost dismissively. An old house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by forest in poor condition, a structure that had belonged to the family generations ago, but had long since fallen out of use. According to the will, that property was to be left entirely to Eleanor. Silence followed, the kind that invited reaction. Marcus was the first to respond. He smiled, not unkindly, but with unmistakable relief. Clara let out a small laugh and quickly covered her mouth, as if she had been caught doing something inappropriate. Another sibling murmured that it seemed fitting, that Eleanor had always preferred quiet places. Someone said it was nice she would have something of her own. Eleanor said nothing. She felt the room tilt slightly, as if she were suddenly standing on unfamiliar ground. She barely remembered the house they were speaking of. Only fragments surfaced. A vague sense of trees and shadows, a memory of being told not to wander too far when she was very young. It had never been a place she was meant to inhabit. When they returned to the family home, the atmosphere shifted again. Grief gave way fully to logistics. Marcus suggested it might be best if Eleanor moved out sooner rather than later. It would make things simpler, he said, easier for everyone to grieve properly. Clara added that the house would feel too crowded otherwise. Another sibling remarked that Eleanor had always valued independence. No one asked what she wanted. She packed that night. The task took far less time than she expected. Clothes, books, a few personal items she had managed to keep through years of gradual erasure. As she moved from room to room, she became acutely aware of how little of herself remained. The walls held her parents' history, her siblings' ambitions, but almost no trace of her own. It was as though she had been preparing for this departure without knowing it. In the morning, Marcus drove her to the edge of the forest. The road narrowed as they left the main street, the pavement giving way to uneven gravel. Trees rose on either side, bare branches tangling overhead, blocking out the sky. Eleanor watched the scenery change through the window, feeling as though she were being carried backward in time. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say that would not sound rehearsed. When the car stopped, Eleanor thought at first there must have been some mistake. The house stood slightly crooked among the trees, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and neglect. One side leaned more than the other, as if the structure were tired of standing upright. A wooden ladder rested against the front, its rungs warped and uneven. The windows were dark, some partially boarded, others clouded with grime. Ivy crept along the walls, claiming what time had weakened. Marcus got out of the car and opened the trunk. He handed Eleanor her suitcase without meeting her eyes. He forced a lightness into his voice as he gestured toward the house. He said it needed some work, that she had always liked quiet places. Eleanor nodded. She stepped closer, her boots sinking slightly into damp leaves. The air smelled of earth and decay, sharp and cold in her lungs. Marcus lingered behind her for a moment, then cleared his throat. He told her she would manage, that she always did. Then he got back into the car and drove away, the sound of the engine fading quickly into the forest. Eleanor stood alone. The silence here was deeper than anything she had known in the family home. It did not hum with suppressed conversation or polite restraint. It pressed in from all sides, complete and indifferent. She opened the door with effort. It creaked loudly, protesting the disturbance. Inside, the space was dim and cold. Dust hung in the air, visible in thin beams of light slipping through gaps in the roof. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight. She set her suitcase down and leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. Only then did the full weight of the past days descend on her. The loss of her parents, the quiet rejection by her siblings, the ease with which she had been laughed aside. They believed this house was a joke, a punishment, a place she would endure briefly before giving up. Eleanor did not yet know why her parents had chosen this for her, or what they had hidden within its decaying walls. As evening approached and the forest darkened around the house, Eleanor lit a small lamp and sat on the floor wrapped in her coat. The wind moved through the trees, brushing against the broken roof, whispering through the cracks. She listened alone at the beginning of a life she had never planned, standing at the threshold of something that would demand far more than she yet understood. The lamp burned low as night settled fully around the house, its weak glow barely holding back the darkness that pressed against the walls. Eleanor sat on the floor with her back against the cold wood, her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The silence she had noticed earlier deepened as the forest grew still, no longer curious, no longer shifting. It was the silence of something vast and unconcerned, a silence that did not adjust itself for human presence. She listened to the house breathe. That was the only way she could describe it. The slow creaking of beams as the temperature dropped, the occasional sharp groan of wood strained by age and neglect. Each sound traveled through her nerves, keeping her alert long after exhaustion should have claimed her. She wondered how many nights the house had stood like this, empty and waiting, long before she had been sent here to inhabit it like an afterthought. Eventually, fatigue outweighed fear. Eleanor lay down on the floor near the wall, folding her coat beneath her head. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and uneasy. She dreamed of corridors that narrowed as she walked, of doors that closed silently behind her, no matter how carefully she moved. When she woke, it was still dark, though a faint grayness suggested that morning was not far away. The smell reached her before anything else. Damp wood, earth, something faintly sour that spoke of years without care. Eleanor opened her eyes and stared at the low ceiling, its surface stained and cracked. The truth returned without mercy. This was not temporary lodging. This was where she had been placed. She sat up slowly, her muscles stiff, her breath forming faint clouds in the cold air. Outside, the forest had begun to wake. She could hear distant birds, the rustle of leaves stirred by wind, the muted crack of a branch somewhere far off. Inside the house, there was only stillness. The contrast unsettled her. It felt as though the world beyond the walls continued without effort, while the space she occupied struggled simply to exist. Eleanor stood and moved carefully toward the nearest window. The glass was clouded with grime, opaque enough that she had to wipe it with her sleeve to see through. Trees pressed close on all sides, their trunks tall and indifferent, their branches interwoven overhead. The house did not dominate the land. It was swallowed by it. She stepped outside, pulling her coat tighter around herself. The ground was uneven, covered in wet leaves and patches of moss that yielded beneath her boots. In the gray morning light, the house looked worse than it had the day before. The damage was no longer softened by shadow. Gaps in the roof were clearly visible, allowing daylight to spill through like an accusation. The walls bore deep cracks, the wood warped and gray, as though time had moved more quickly here than elsewhere. The ladder leaned against the front, its presence oddly deliberate, as if someone had once planned to fix the roof and never return. Eleanor touched one of the rungs. It crumbled slightly beneath her fingers. A sharp surge of anger rose in her chest, sudden and unexpected. Not at the house itself, but at the laughter she could still hear in her mind, the polite amusement in her siblings' voices, the way the notary had said "old house," as though the words were self-explanatory, as though no further thought were required. They had known exactly what they were doing. They had expected this place to defeat her quietly. The thought made her straighten her shoulders. She returned inside and began to explore more deliberately. The interior was divided into a few small rooms, poorly defined, as though the house had been altered repeatedly without a clear plan. There was a main space that might once have served as a living area, a narrow adjoining room that could have been a bedroom, and a back section holding the remains of what looked like a kitchen. There was no electricity, no running water, no sign of recent habitation. Dust coated every surface. Cobwebs stretched between corners like fragile bridges. She opened cabinets that hung crooked on their hinges. Most were empty, but one held a single chipped mug and a rusted pot. She lifted them carefully, struck by the strange intimacy of the objects. Someone had lived here once, not briefly or accidentally, but with intention. As she moved through the rooms, she became aware of something else. The house did not simply stand there passively, it resisted her. Doors stuck when she tried to open them. Floorboards groaned sharply beneath her weight, as though warning her to step back. Cold drafts slipped through cracks no matter how tightly she closed the shutters. It was as though the house itself questioned her presence, uncertain whether she belonged. By midday, exhaustion set in. Eleanor sat on the floor near the doorway, her back against the wall, staring out at the forest. Hunger gnawed at her, but she felt little appetite. The silence pressed on her thoughts, giving them too much room to wander. She thought of the family home, of warm kitchens and thick carpets, of a life where discomfort had always been softened by proximity to others. That world felt unreal now, like something she had imagined rather than lived. A wave of doubt washed over her. She could leave. She could go to a hotel, to a friend, anywhere else. She did not have much money, but she had enough for a short escape. No one was forcing her to stay here. The house did not want her, and she was not certain she wanted it either. As if in response, a sudden gust of wind rattled the loose boards above her head. Dust fell from the ceiling, making her cough. Eleanor flinched, her heart racing. She stood abruptly and stepped outside, breathing deeply until the panic eased. The forest loomed around her, vast and unbothered. It did not care whether she stayed or left. And somehow, that indifference steadied her more than kindness ever had. Her parents had chosen this place for her, not her siblings, not chance, her parents. The thought lingered as she returned inside and began to clean, if only to keep her hands busy. She swept dust into small piles, wiped surfaces with an old cloth she found in her suitcase, opened windows to let in air despite the cold. Each action was small, almost laughably insignificant against the scale of decay, but it was something she could control. As the afternoon wore on, she noticed details that unsettled her assumptions. Beneath the grime, the woodwork revealed careful craftsmanship. Certain joints were reinforced in ways that suggested foresight rather than haste. The shelves, though warped, had been fitted precisely to the walls. Even the placement of the windows seemed deliberate, angled to catch light at specific times of day. This had not been a temporary shelter. Someone had planned to live here. The realization deepened her unease. Why had her parents kept this place hidden from her? Why leave her something so demanding, so openly hostile at first glance? As evening approached, the temperature dropped sharply. Eleanor layered her clothes and lit the small portable lantern she had brought with her. Shadows danced along the walls, distorting their shape. She ate a simple meal from her bag and sat quietly, listening as the sounds of the forest grew louder with nightfall. Fear returned with the darkness, creeping into her thoughts. Every creak sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind felt like a warning. She lay down near the door, her back pressed against the wall. The lantern dimmed to conserve power. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of falling through rotten floors and calling out to voices that never answered. When she woke again, it was still dark. Rain drummed softly against the roof, slipping through the gaps and landing on the floor in cold drops. Eleanor watched the water pool near the far wall, her chest tightening. The house was not merely uncomfortable, it was unsafe. She sat up, her mind racing. This place could kill her slowly through cold, illness, or collapse. The thought terrified her more than her siblings' cruelty ever had. And yet, beneath the fear, something else stirred. A quiet, stubborn resolve she barely recognized as her own. If this house was meant to defeat her, then leaving now would mean accepting the role they had written for her. The quiet one, the weak one, the sister who took what she was given and disappeared. Eleanor rose to her feet as the rain continued to fall. She moved a bucket beneath the worst leak, wiped water from the floor, and sat down again, wrapped tightly in her coat. The house did not welcome her. It tested her, chilled her, unsettled her. But as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the edges of the forest once more, Eleanor realized something quietly profound. She was still here, and for now that was enough to take her one step deeper into the life waiting for her, beyond fear, beyond exile, and beyond the silence she had been taught to accept. Morning arrived slowly, as if the forest itself were reluctant to disturb the fragile equilibrium Eleanor had found during the night. The rain had stopped before dawn, leaving the air heavy with moisture and the scent of wet earth. Pale light filtered through the trees and slipped into the house through its broken roof and clouded windows, revealing the full extent of its neglect without the mercy of shadow. Eleanor woke stiff and aching, her body protesting the hard floor and the cold that had settled deep into her muscles. For a few moments she lay still, listening to the steady drip of water into the bucket she had placed beneath the leak. Each sound marked time with quiet insistence, reminding her that nothing here would pause simply because she was tired. She sat up and wrapped her coat around herself again, moving carefully as though the house might respond badly to sudden motion. In the gray light, the interior looked even more desolate. Cracks in the walls appeared deeper, stains on the ceiling darker, the warped boards more pronounced. The house no longer hid its damage. It seemed to present it openly, as if daring her to acknowledge the truth of what she had been given. Eleanor stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly, taking it all in. She could not stay like this, not indefinitely. The house demanded more than passive endurance. At the same time, leaving without understanding why she had been sent here felt unbearable. That question hovered at the edge of her thoughts, pressing forward no matter how she tried to ignore it. Why this place? Why her? She began the day with more intention than before, not with repairs which were far beyond her ability at the moment, but with observation. She moved through the room slowly, noting their shape, their connections, the way light entered and left them. It felt less like exploration and more like reading a text written in a language she did not yet understand. She told herself that if her parents had chosen this house for her, then it must contain something they believed she needed to learn. Near the back wall of what might once have been a bedroom, she noticed an old dresser pushed awkwardly into the corner. One of its drawers sat slightly open, warped enough that it refused to close completely. Eleanor knelt and tugged at it. The wood protested with a sharp groan before giving way. A cloud of dust rose into the air, making her cough. Inside, beneath a layer of grime, lay a small stack of papers bound together with twine that had long since frayed. Eleanor's breath caught. The papers were yellowed and brittle at the edges, their surface marked by age and careful handling. She did not need to read a word to recognize the handwriting. Her mother's neat, precise script slanted slightly to the right, each letter formed with deliberate care. Her father's writing was heavier, uneven. The pen pressed hard into the page as though each word had required effort. Eleanor carried the bundle to the window and sat on the floor, letting the weak light fall across the pages. Her hands trembled as she untied the string. The first letter was addressed simply, without formality, as though the writer had never imagined it would be read by anyone else. She began to read. The words unfolded slowly, not as explanation, but as reflection. They spoke of the house and the land around it, of memories tied to its walls, and of decisions made together over long evenings of quiet conversation. Her parents wrote not with apology, but with careful honesty. They acknowledged the difficulty of what they were leaving her, the discomfort, the uncertainty, the burden that would come with it. Then they wrote about her. They wrote of Eleanor's quiet strength, of the way she observed rather than dominated, of how she endured without demanding recognition. They wrote that she had always needed something different from what the world so easily offered her siblings. Not comfort, not security handed down without effort, but something that could not be taken from her by louder voices or stronger wills. Eleanor felt a pressure build behind her eyes as she read. This was not an act of neglect. It was not an afterthought. It was an act of faith. As she turned the pages, the tone shifted. The letters spoke of unfinished repairs, of legal matters left unresolved, of responsibilities tied to the house and land that demanded patience rather than money. Her parents admitted they had known the house would not offer her ease. It would offer her a trial. They wrote that they believed she would understand this in time, that she would learn what could not be taught through protection alone. Eleanor let the papers fall into her lap and stared at the floor. A bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Her siblings had believed this house was a punishment. They had been wrong. It was worse than that. It was a test. The realization settled heavily in her chest. Anger flared, sharp and unexpected. Anger at her parents for leaving her something so demanding. Anger at herself for feeling ungrateful. Anger at a family that had reduced inheritance to comfort instead of meaning. The house seemed to listen as she sat there, silent and unmoving, as though waiting for her response. "You didn't make this easy," she said aloud, her voice echoing faintly off the walls. The words hung in the air, unanswered, and yet, speaking them eased something inside her. She was allowed to struggle with this, allowed to resent the weight of what had been placed on her shoulders. The test, she realized, was not one of blind acceptance. It was one of endurance. Later that day, Eleanor resumed her exploration with renewed focus. Her search was no longer aimless. It was guided by the knowledge that there was more hidden here than decay. Behind a loose board near the remains of the kitchen wall, she found an old metal box. It resisted her at first. The lid rusted nearly shut, but with effort it opened. Inside were documents she barely understood at first glance. Old property records, notes written in careful, cramped handwriting, references to debts tied to the land, obligations that had never been fully resolved. Eleanor's stomach tightened as the implications became clear. The house was not only falling apart physically, it was burdened by the past in ways that could easily crush someone unprepared. This, she realized, was why her siblings had been spared. They would never have accepted such a burden. They would have sold the land, walked away, erased the problem. Her parents had known that. They had chosen someone who would not. Exhaustion washed over her as she sat back on her heels. The box opened before her. The house no longer felt hostile in the same way it had before. It felt demanding, insistent, indifferent to excuses. It did not care about fairness or comfort. It demanded competence, attention, commitment. It demanded that she show up fully or not at all. As the day passed, Eleanor discovered more signs of intention woven into the house's structure. Reinforced beams hidden beneath rot, drainage channels carefully planned but long clogged with debris. Even the position of the house itself, angled slightly to shield it from the harshest winds, spoke of foresight. Someone had loved this place enough to think ahead, even if time had undone much of their work. With each discovery, her understanding shifted. The house was not rejecting her. It was indifferent. And in that indifference, there was a strange kind of honesty. It would not bend to her fear or her doubt. It would not soften itself for her sake. It would either be cared for or it would continue to decay. That evening, Eleanor sat at the small table she had dragged into the main room. The letters lay spread before her, their pages smoothed by repeated readings. She reread them slowly, absorbing not just the words but the trust behind them. Her parents had known exactly how difficult this would be. They had also known she would not be destroyed by it. She slept more deeply that night, exhaustion finally claiming her without resistance. When she woke the next morning, the house felt no warmer, no kinder, but it felt different, less like an enemy, more like an unresolved argument that demanded an answer. Standing in the doorway as the forest stirred awake once more, Eleanor felt the weight of a choice settle fully onto her shoulders. She did not yet know how she would repair the house, untangle its debts, or survive the coming months. But she knew this much. If she walked away now, she would carry this unfinished question with her forever. She stepped back inside and closed the door behind her. The sound echoed through the space, firm and deliberate. And for the first time since arriving, Eleanor began not merely to endure the house, but to plan. Once Eleanor accepted that she would not leave, the house seemed to respond with a kind of merciless honesty. Its weaknesses revealed themselves all at once, as though the structure sensed hesitation and sought to exploit it. What she had once mistaken for random decay now appeared deliberate in its timing. A draft she had ignored became unbearable. A loose board shifted dangerously beneath her weight. The leaks she had contained with buckets multiplied after the next rain, forcing her to acknowledge that endurance alone would not keep the roof from collapsing. She chose to begin with the roof not because she felt capable, but because fear left her no alternative. Each night she lay awake listening for the sound of splitting wood, imagining the weight of wet beams giving way above her. The thought followed her through the day, tightening her chest until action became the only relief. The ladder outside terrified her, its rungs bent under her weight, warped by years of exposure. Each step required testing, her hands gripping the sides until her knuckles burned. More than once she froze halfway up, her heart pounding as the forest spun around her. The house loomed beneath her, fragile and exposed, its failures laid bare from above. Rot had eaten through entire sections of the roof, leaving gaps large enough to see the floor below. Moss clung thickly to the shingles, holding moisture like a sponge, accelerating the decay. Her hands blistered quickly. Nails left exposed decades ago tore into her skin. Splintered boards gave way without warning, sending sharp pain through her palms and wrists. She learned through trial and error, her movements awkward and uncertain. Each mistake carried consequences that lingered long after the moment passed. There were times she climbed down shaking, convinced she had made a terrible mistake in choosing to stay. The days blurred together. She worked until her muscles trembled, stopping only when pain sharpened into something she could no longer ignore. At night she collapsed onto the floor, too exhausted to eat properly, too tired to dream. Hunger came and went, overshadowed by the constant ache in her body. Failure became familiar. A board she replaced would slip loose the next morning. A section she believed secure would leak again with the next rain. Each setback felt personal, as though the house were reminding her of her inexperience, her isolation. There were moments when she cried openly, slumped against the wall with dirt streaking her face, tears cutting clean paths through the grime. No one saw her. No one offered encouragement. The forest bore silent witness, indifferent and vast. It was during one of those moments, when despair pressed closest to surrender, that she heard footsteps. At first she thought exhaustion had begun to distort her senses. The sound persisted, steady and unmistakable, approaching from the direction of the narrow path that led toward the road. Eleanor wiped her face quickly and stood, her heart racing. She stepped outside, bracing herself for intrusion. A man emerged from between the trees, carrying a bundle of wooden planks on his shoulder. He stopped when he saw her, surprise flickering across his face. They stood there for a moment, measuring each other in silence. He was around her age, perhaps a few years older, with the look of someone accustomed to physical labor. His clothes were worn but clean, his hands rough, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested competence rather than arrogance. There was no trace of curiosity meant to entertain itself at her expense. "I didn't know anyone was living here," he said finally. "I am," Eleanor replied. The defensiveness in her voice surprised even her. "Now?" he asked, not mockingly, simply confirming. "Yes." He nodded, accepting the answer without comment. "I'm Daniel. I work on properties around here. Clearing land, repairs. I was told this place was abandoned." "It was," she said. "It isn't anymore." Another pause followed. His gaze moved briefly to the roof, then to the ladder, then back to her. His expression did not soften with pity, nor did it sharpen with judgment. It remained observant. "That section won't hold much longer," he said calmly. "Not unless you reinforce it from the inside." Irritation flared hot and immediate. "I know," Eleanor said more sharply than she intended. Daniel lifted one hand slightly, unoffended. "Just saying. I didn't come to interfere." She studied him, uncertain what to make of his presence. Strangers had not figured into her calculations. Isolation had seemed absolute. "What do you want?" she asked. He hesitated, then shifted the planks on his shoulder. "I was going to offer these to whoever owned the place. Left over from another job. Seemed ashamed to waste them." Eleanor's gaze dropped to the wood, then returned to his face. Pride rose quickly, rigid and instinctive. She had accepted enough unwanted generosity from her family. She was not eager to begin again. "I don't need charity," she said. Daniel considered her for a moment, then nodded. "All right." He turned slightly, preparing to leave. The ease with which he accepted her refusal unsettled her more than insistence would have. He did not argue or press. He treated her answer as final. "Wait," she said, surprising herself. He turned back. "How much do you want for them?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Nothing. But if it makes you feel better, you can help me unload them." They carried the planks together, stacking them near the wall. Daniel worked efficiently and quietly, without commentary or questions. Eleanor found herself matching his pace, grateful for the temporary absence of tension. When they finished, he stepped back and dusted off his hands. "If you need advice," he said, "I live not far from here. You can ask or not, up to you." With that, he left, disappearing into the trees as quietly as he had arrived. In the days that followed, Daniel returned intermittently. Sometimes he brought materials. Sometimes he simply checked on her progress. He never stayed long. He never overstayed his welcome. When Eleanor asked questions, he answered plainly, without lecturing. When she struggled, he showed her how to adjust her grip, her stance, her approach. They worked side by side, often in silence. Words came slowly, naturally, without urgency. Daniel spoke of his life in fragments, revealing just enough to make him human without inviting sympathy. He had lost people too, not recently, but deeply enough that the absence still shaped his days. Eleanor found herself talking more than she intended. About the house, about her parents, about the way her family had turned on her with careful smiles and clean hands. Daniel listened without interruption, without offering solutions. "I don't need you to fix this," she said once, frustration edging her voice. "I just need to get through it." He nodded. "That's usually how it is." As the house slowly changed, so did Eleanor. The work became less frantic and more deliberate. She learned to read the structure, to anticipate its weaknesses before they revealed themselves through failure. Her hands toughened. Her movements grew surer. She still misjudged, still failed, but the failures no longer sent her spiraling into despair. The house responded in its own way. The leaks lessened. The drafts softened. Light began to settle differently in the rooms as boards were replaced and spaces reclaimed. It was not comfort that emerged, but stability. Daniel never positioned himself as a savior. He left when his work was done, trusting her to continue alone. That trust mattered more than any repair he helped complete. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, they sat on the steps Eleanor had rebuilt that afternoon. The forest glowed briefly with fading light, then darkened. "You don't have to stay here forever," Daniel said quietly. Eleanor considered the statement. "I know, but I'm staying now." "Yes," he nodded. "That matters." For the first time since arriving at the house, something loosened inside her. Not hope exactly, but something steadier. The sense that struggle did not have to be solitary, even if the path remained her own. As Daniel stood to leave, Eleanor realized she no longer associated the house solely with fear. It was still demanding, still harsh, but it was no longer empty, and neither was she. The house no longer startled Eleanor with sudden protests. Its sounds had become familiar, almost conversational, a language she was slowly learning to understand. Floorboards creaked where they always had, not in warning, but in recognition. The roof held firm through rain now, no longer accusing her with steady drips in the dark. Even the air inside had changed. It still carried the scent of old wood and earth, but beneath it lay something cleaner, sharper, as if effort itself had altered the atmosphere. With that change came a quiet certainty that the work she had done so far was only the surface of what the house demanded. The letters from her parents remained spread across the small table in the main room, their pages smoothed by repeated readings. Eleanor had memorized much of what they said, but one sentence in particular refused to loosen its hold on her thoughts. It was written in her father's heavier hand, the ink pressed deep into the paper as though the words had carried weight even then. "You will know when the house is ready to tell you the rest." At first she had dismissed it as sentiment, a poetic attempt to soften the burden they had left her. Now, standing in the quiet half-light of the room, she felt a faint unease settle in her chest. The house was changing, so was she. And with that change came the growing sense that something remained unresolved, hidden not by accident but by design. It was Daniel who led her closer to it, without meaning to. They were working near the back wall one afternoon, clearing debris that had accumulated over decades. This section of the house had remained untouched longer than the others, partially blocked by collapsed shelving and old crates fused together by moisture and time. Eleanor had avoided it instinctively, unsure whether she feared what she might find or what she might not. As they shifted a heavy beam aside, Daniel paused. "This wall doesn't match the rest," he said. Eleanor frowned and stepped closer. At first glance, it looked no different from the surrounding boards, weathered and darkened by age. But once she looked more carefully, she saw what he meant. The wood here was newer, though still old by any reasonable measure. The nails were different too, set at irregular intervals, driven with a hand that had not followed the original pattern of the house. "Someone closed this off," Daniel said, "a long time ago." Her heart began to race. She knelt and ran her fingers along the seams. When she pressed against one section, it responded with a faint hollow sound, subtle but unmistakable. They worked in silence after that, dismantling the wall carefully, piece by piece. Dust filled the air, stinging Eleanor's eyes, but she did not stop. Each board came away reluctantly, as though resisting exposure. When the last plank finally loosened, it revealed a shallow cavity no deeper than a narrow closet, hidden entirely from view. Inside, stacked neatly and wrapped in oilcloth, darkened by age, were documents. Eleanor's breath caught. She reached for them slowly, her hands trembling as she unfolded the first paper, then the next. Deeds, old ones. Survey maps marked with careful annotations. Legal records bearing dates that stretch back generations. "This isn't just the house," she whispered. The land described in the documents extended far beyond the immediate clearing. Acres of forest, boundaries drawn in precise lines that cut directly through areas her siblings had always assumed belonged to the family estate attached to the main house. The truth settled into her chest with a strange mix of triumph and dread. Her parents had not merely left her a decaying structure, they had left her the foundation of something far greater. Daniel watched her face change as she read. "Do your siblings know about this?" he asked carefully. Eleanor shook her head. "They think this place is worthless." "They won't," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "They won't." The past did not take long to resurface with sharp teeth. A week later, Eleanor received a call from her sister Clara. The tone was different from before. Polite, measured, too careful to be sincere. "We heard you're doing some renovations," Clara said. "Yes," Eleanor replied evenly, "and that you found some old paperwork." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. The house had spoken, and the sound had carried farther than she expected. "We should discuss this together," Clara continued. "After all, it concerns family property." Together. The word tasted bitter. The discussion, when it came, was nothing like Clara's voice had promised. Eleanor returned to the family home for the first time since her exile, stepping once more into the polished halls that now felt foreign. Her siblings were waiting in the living room, their expressions tight, their posture unified in a way that excluded her completely. Marcus spoke first. "You should have told us what you found." "I didn't know I had to," Eleanor replied calmly. "The house was left to me. So was everything in it." "That doesn't mean you own the land," another sibling said sharply. "That land has always been part of the estate." Eleanor placed the documents on the table. "According to these, it hasn't. Not for a long time." Silence followed as they examined the papers. She watched their faces shift from disbelief to calculation. It was a transformation she recognized well. "This changes things," Marcus said slowly. "It changes nothing," Eleanor replied, "except that now you know." What followed was swift and revealing. Arguments layered with accusations disguised as concern. They spoke of fairness, of unity, of how Eleanor had always misunderstood her place within the family. They suggested legal reviews, shared ownership, compromises designed to benefit everyone. "I'm not negotiating," Eleanor said at last. Marcus's voice hardened. "You don't understand what you're risking." "I understand perfectly," she replied. "You assumed I would fail. You assumed this place would break me. You were wrong." The room erupted. Pretense fell away, replaced by anger, sharpened by envy. Eleanor saw clearly then what she had always sensed but never named. Her siblings had not resented her weakness. They had resented her difference. She left without looking back. The pressure intensified in the days that followed. Letters arrived from lawyers. Phone calls came at all hours. Distant relatives reached out suddenly, offering advice they had never bothered to give before. The past clawed at her present, determined to reclaim what it had dismissed. Through it all, the house remained steady. Daniel noticed the strain immediately. He did not ask questions at first. He stayed longer, worked harder, filled the silence with presence rather than solutions. When Eleanor finally told him everything, she expected concern or doubt. Instead, he nodded. "They underestimated you." "Yes," she said. "And now they want to correct that mistake." He looked toward the forest, then back at the house. "This place didn't survive this long by accident. Neither did you." That night, Eleanor sat alone with the documents spread around her. She traced the lines on the maps, the names written in careful ink. She thought of her parents, of the choice they had made, knowing exactly how difficult this would become. The house had given her its truth. What she did with it would define everything that followed. The house stood nearly whole now. It was not beautiful in the way new things are beautiful, with smooth lines and flawless surfaces that pretend time does not exist. Its beauty was quieter, earned rather than displayed. The wood still bore scars where rot had once taken hold. The walls remained uneven, their history written plainly for anyone who cared to look closely. Yet it stood with a confidence that had been absent when Eleanor first arrived, no longer leaning away from the world in quiet surrender. She noticed the change most clearly in herself. Each morning she woke with purpose instead of dread. The ache in her muscles had become familiar, almost reassuring, a reminder of effort spent rather than weakness endured. Her hands, once soft, now carried calluses that no longer surprised her when she caught sight of them in the dim light of early dawn. She moved through the house without hesitation, knowing where each board would creak, which step needed reinforcement, which window caught the afternoon sun just long enough to warm the room before evening returned. The house no longer tested her with cruelty. It tested her with responsibility. The documents she had found were now carefully organized, studied until the unfamiliar language of property law began to take shape in her mind. With Daniel's help and the guidance of a local attorney he trusted, Eleanor began the slow, deliberate process of formally asserting her rights to the land. It was exhausting work of a different kind, filled with measured words, deliberate delays, and calculated resistance. Each step forward seemed to provoke a reaction from her siblings, who circled at a distance, watching for any opening. They wrote letters that dripped with false warmth. They suggested meetings, dinners, reconciliations that came attached to expectations Eleanor no longer accepted. They spoke often of what their parents would have wanted, as though invoking the dead might restore authority they had lost. Eleanor read every message carefully, then she set them aside. What unsettled her was not their persistence, but the realization that she no longer needed their approval. The anger that had once flared at the thought of them had dulled, replaced by something quieter and more dangerous: indifference. It did not announce itself dramatically. It simply arrived one day and refused to leave. It was Daniel who first gave voice to what Eleanor had been circling in her thoughts for weeks. They stood at the edge of the property one evening, the forest stretching endlessly beyond the boundary markers Eleanor had recently uncovered. The light was fading, the air cool and still. The land felt vast in a way it never had before, no longer intimidating but expansive. "You could stay here," Daniel said almost casually. "Build something permanent. This land could support it." Eleanor did not answer immediately. She had imagined this future herself, a life rooted here. The house restored fully, perhaps expanded. The land shaped into something lasting. It would be a victory in every sense. Proof that she had not only survived exile, but transformed it. And yet the idea did not settle in her chest the way she expected it to. "I know," she said finally, "but I'm not sure that's what this was meant to be." Daniel studied her face. "What do you mean?" She turned back toward the house. From a distance it looked calm, almost watchful. "This place taught me how to stand on my own," she said slowly. "How to endure. How to choose myself when no one else would. But staying here forever would mean living inside the memory of that fight." Daniel said nothing, but she felt his understanding. He had never mistaken her strength for stubbornness. He knew the difference between building something because it was right and clinging to something because it had cost too much to abandon. The pressure from her family intensified as her legal claims advanced. One afternoon, Marcus arrived unannounced. He stepped out of his car with the same controlled confidence he had always worn like armor, though it fit him less comfortably now. He looked around at the restored structure, the cleared land, the visible evidence of Eleanor's labor. "I didn't think you'd get this far," he said. Eleanor did not rise to the implied insult. "Neither did I." He hesitated, then sighed. "You're forcing us into a corner." "I didn't force anything," she replied. "You assumed I would fail." Marcus's jaw tightened. "We can still make this easy." "There is no easy version of this anymore," Eleanor said. He studied her then, truly studied her, perhaps for the first time. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect, but recognition. "You've changed," he said. "Yeah," she answered. "That was the point." When he left, Eleanor felt no triumph, only clarity. The house had done its work. That night, she sat alone at the small table where she had first read her parents' letters. She spread them out once more, reading not just the words but the intention beneath them. They had not wanted her to prove anything to her siblings. They had wanted her to prove something to herself. Daniel joined her later, sitting across from her in quiet companionship. The lamp cast soft light over the familiar pages. "I don't want to lose this," he said carefully. "Us." Eleanor reached for his hand, her grip steady. "You won't, but I can't build my future on defiance." He met her gaze. "What do you want?" The answer came without hesitation. "I want a life that isn't shaped by what was taken from me. I want to choose where I go next, not because I won something, but because I'm ready to move on." They spoke late into the night, not of escape, but of direction, of places unmarked by resentment, of building something together not as survivors clinging to victory, but as partners choosing possibility. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor completed the legal process with calm determination. She secured her rights fully, not to punish her siblings, but to close the chapter cleanly. When the final documents were signed, she felt not relief, but a profound stillness. The house no longer asked anything of her. The morning she left, the forest was unusually quiet. No wind stirred the branches. No birds marked the passing of time. The silence felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. Pale light filtered through the trees, settling gently on the roof she had rebuilt with her own hands, on the steps she had repaired board by board. Eleanor stood at the edge of the clearing with her suitcase at her feet. Daniel waited a few steps behind her, giving her space without needing to be asked. She let her gaze move slowly over every familiar detail. She remembered the first night on the floor, cold and terrified, listening to water drip through the broken roof. The mornings when her hands shook from exhaustion. The anger and humiliation that had followed her into the forest like a shadow. None of it felt heavy now. The house no longer represented exile or punishment. It stood simply as what it was, a place where she had learned who she was when nothing was given freely. Eleanor stepped forward and placed her hand against the wooden wall. The surface was rough beneath her palm, solid and warm where the sun had touched it. "Thank you," she whispered, unsure whether she was speaking to the house, the land, or the past itself. She turned away and did not look back. Their new home stood at the edge of a small town, modest but sturdy, with clean lines and windows that welcomed light without resistance. It did not challenge her. It did not demand proof. It simply opened itself to her presence. For the first time in years, Eleanor entered a space without bracing for harm. They built their life slowly, deliberately. Each room took shape through shared decisions rather than solitary endurance. Daniel did not take over, and Eleanor did not retreat into silence. They created something balanced, grounded not in survival, but in choice. Her siblings did not disappear. They remained at a distance, watching, measuring. When Marcus called, his voice cautious and strained, Eleanor listened without resentment. "I didn't think it would end this way," he admitted once. "Neither did I," she replied, "but this way is better." She did not return to family gatherings. She did not seek reconciliation that required self-erasure. The chapter closed without bitterness, but with finality. In quiet moments, Eleanor thought of her parents. She understood them now in ways she had not before. They had known the cost of what they were leaving her. They had also known her capacity to bear it. Inheritance, she realized, is not always meant to comfort. Sometimes it is meant to shape. Years later, when Eleanor spoke of that time, she did so without drama. She did not frame herself as a victim or a victor. She spoke instead of learning how to endure without hardening, how to choose without resentment, how to leave without abandoning what mattered. The old house remained in her life, preserved as a place of history rather than struggle, a marker of passage, not a destination. And with that beginning behind her, Eleanor lived fully in the life she had chosen, carrying forward not the pain of exile, but the strength it had revealed. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. Your support helps these stories reach more people and allows us to keep creating thoughtful, immersive narratives like this one. Be sure to check out the other videos on the channel for more stories about hidden strength, quiet resilience, and unexpected beginnings. And if you think someone else might connect with this story, share it with them. More stories are coming soon, and you won't want to miss what's next.